There we go. This week we begin the Torah, the new cycle of the Torah, and we start with Bereshit. Bereshit, right in the beginning, the word Bereshit, which means in the beginning. And it's interesting that the word Bereshit in the beginning means that Rashi points out the classic commentary on the Torah that Bereshit doesn't mean that that the Torah is about to tell us how things unfolded directly. Bereshit means in the beginning. In other words, in the beginning of creation, this was all going on, right? So, in other words, it's not necessarily is the description in Bereshit going giving us all the information for exactly what's happening with creation, right? Because it opens right away with talking about light. There's darkness, there's chaos. Light. There's the God's. It says that God's glory is was or spirit was hovering over the water. What water? We didn't talk about water. If you're starting from nothing, what's going on? But the Torah really doesn't necessarily realize or appreciate it. The Torah jumps into the beginning already within sort of the beginning. So Bereshit means in the beginning, in the beginning of creation, and the Torah portion of Bereshit spans about almost 1,500 years of history. So the Torah, and I'm sure this will be a theme that we will revisit, mention, reference throughout the year. The Torah is not a book of history, not merely a book of history. It contains history and contains historical fact, and it's not chronological, the Torah as well. But while it contains history, that's not the function of Torah. The Torah was not written as a history of the world or even necessarily as a history of the Jewish people. The Torah is a book of instruction, right? So, and yet when we talk about the history in the Torah, so talking about 1,500 years, covering 1,500 years of history, where the rest of the Torah covers, if you include next week's Torah portion, which is Noah, which covers about 1,000 years of history. After that, the rest of the Torah covers about 200 or so years of history. And the vast majority of the 5 books of Moses cover 40 years of history. So this week's Torah portion is disproportionately covering a lot of ground, and therefore there's a lot going on there, and there's a lot of very interesting things, because the opening scene of humanity, as described in the Torah, is very interesting and very different than the way we know humanity and the way we know life on earth. And so the Torah portion begins with creation, the story of creation. God creates the world in 6 days, rests on the 7th, and the Sabbath. It then goes on to talk about the creation of Adam, first human, and Eve, and then their children, then the story of Cain and Abel, the sin of the tree of knowledge, and the idea of death being brought into the world as a result of the sin of the tree of knowledge, the people being in the Garden of Eden and then being banished from the Garden of Eden, then people living a very long life. So we have a chronology of generations, starting with Adam and then his descendants. And one of the things that jumps out is that people lived exceptionally long lives, about around 1,000 years. That was the sort of the lifespan right in the beginning. But what I want to do is, in the little time we have together, is talk a little bit about the opening words of the Torah, which are Bereshit, Bara, Elokim, et hashamayim v'et haaretz. Right? Everybody's familiar with these first words. Genesis 1, chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Now, these words, in the beginning, God created. Bereshit, Bara, Elokim. In the beginning, God created. So let's start with the second word. We touched a little bit on the first word, Bereshit, but the second word, Bara, created, that God creates. The Baal Shem Tov taught that there are 3 translations of the word bara, right? The simple translation of the word is creation, right? That God creates. That's the literal and obvious, straightforward understanding of the word. In fact, one of the great commentaries on the Torah actually talks about the idea that bara specifically, because you can use other words for creating. You can, there's asiyah, which appears later. The word bara specifically implies a creation ex nihilo, right? Which means something from nothing. That when God creates the world, he creates something out of nothingness. And so that's where the word bara means creation, and specifically creation of something out of nothing. Another meaning of the word bara, we find this would be found in the oral tradition in the way that the sages use this term, specifically as it relates to the laws of kosher animals. and whether an animal becomes a treifa, meaning if it develops some kind of a mortal blemish and injury, and the word bara means revealed. The context of it, we don't have time to get into the context in which the word is used that way, but Hebrew, which is the same root, which has the same root as the word bara, which means to reveal. And finally, a third interpretation, which is bara, relates to the word briut, which means health, good health. So we have Bereshit bara Elokim, the first words of the Torah, that in the beginning God both, or three things, creates, reveals, and heals. Right? What is the connection between these three ideas and how they sort of all come together in the beginning, in this opening verse of the Torah? So first thing we have to know is that God creates the world, something out of nothing. A core teaching in Hasidic philosophy is that when you create something out of nothing, creation needs to be constant. It's not something that you can design and create one time and leave it alone. It needs to be constant. An example of this would be things that we do. We don't really have an exact sort of metaphor for it because we don't create anything out of nothing. But to borrow sort of at least conceptually, so we can understand the idea, when we introduce something truly novel, something truly new, it needs to be constantly sustained. So an example of this would be, take a rock, which is an inanimate object, a rock that falls to the ground and doesn't move, right? It doesn't move. And if you were to throw that rock, you introduce flight to the rock, something which is completely new and not natural to the nature of the rock, right? Rocks don't fly, they sit, they're stationary. So when you introduce this new element to the rock, which is flight, in order for the rock to actually fly, it needs to be propelled constantly by the force of your throw, right? The moment the force of the throw dissipates, the rock ceases to move, right? Why? Because flying is not natural, and the possibility of flying is not something that exists within the rock itself. So here we're creating something new. This is something, it's a novelty, a moving, flying rock. That novelty has to be constantly generated in order for that to take place. Similarly, all of existence, its true natural state is non-existence, because before God creates, there's nothing. So since everything's true state is non-existence, in order for it to exist, that's an unnatural state. And therefore, for it to exist, God has to constantly bring it into existence. So when we say that God creates, what that means is that God is not just that he created whenever it was way back in the day, but that God has to constantly create. And so this is the first thing we have to think about when we read Bereshit Bara Elokim et hashamayim et haaretz, that God created. It's not just that he created way back when, one time, it was a one-off event, but that God is constantly creating. What this does for us, if we can actually think about this idea, reflect on this idea, meditate on it, and hopefully internalize it, what that can do for us is help us recognize that every moment of life, every moment in existence is new opportunity. There's new divine energy that is that is present in that moment. That every moment of our reality is a reality that's created at this very moment by God. And so therefore, that reality is subject to change. That reality is something that we never have to be prisoners of our current reality, because it's always being renewed and recreated by God. That's one sort of idea. Another idea, this idea of revelation. The fact of the matter is that that's something, the first interpretation, God constantly creating, is something that we need to meditate on and think about. And certainly in the times that we're gathering now, with everything that's going on in Israel and the horrors that we're seeing, it's very hard to think about God constantly creating this reality, this nightmare that we're living in. We're all asking ourselves, when are we going to wake up from this nightmare, right? God is actively creating it at every moment. Certainly he can change the story immediately and instantaneously, but he doesn't. And we're left to sort of pick up the pieces here. So the second interpretation of the word bara, God creating, is revelation. What we need to do, another thing we have to do, is recognize that the purpose of God creating is to reveal himself. That God creates before, when there's nothing, there's just God. God doesn't want to be alone. God creates in order to make himself known to his creation, to reveal himself to his creation. The problem is that when we reveal ourselves, we also hide ourselves. In order for God to reveal himself to us, he has to create a space for us. In order to create a space for us, he needs to hide himself from us, right? And think about it in terms of our own lives, that we reveal to others, we reveal ourselves to others, and yet the way we reveal ourselves to others is by concealing ourselves. So you will get up in the morning, the first thing you do is you get dressed. before going outside. So you're actually literally concealing your body in order to be visible to other people, right? Or when we communicate to people, communicate ideas, we're actively, while communicating, we're simultaneously concealing the true depth of whatever it is that's going on internally. So God is revealing himself to us in creation, and at the same time he conceals himself, which is why God could be constantly creating the world and constantly creating these nightmares, and he's concealed. We don't see him. He's hiding from us. There's total chaos. There's total darkness. We live in a world that if God's constantly creating it, how in the world could evil prosper to such an extent? How could there be such darkness? And that's precisely because God, while creating, is simultaneously concealing himself. Concealing himself means that he creates, and yet he hides behind all these different layers, that layer after layer after layer, which eventually those layers can be layers of sheer evil, of absolute evil. And it's our job to try and peer through those layers and find God actively within those layers. I'll just share, and we're running. I want to try and have a hard out at 15 minutes, so we're going to run out of time. But the other day, I'm in a number of WhatsApp groups, and a couple of friends were talking, and somebody just went on a rant. A friend who's a rabbi. It was very raw and very personal, and he just went on a rant against God, basically, and against the way we as rabbis are trained, and the way we hope to inspire people to respond and react in times like these. It was very raw. It was very honest, and I must say that I kind of agreed with a lot of what he said. Essentially, without getting into details, he was advocating for just a complete boycott of God during this time. And he was saying that, with a lot of pain and passion. But after this whole rant, he comes out and says, just while, in the stream of consciousness, it's at these moments that I feel most connected to God, that I feel closest to God. When he's struggling with God, when he's fighting with God, when he's arguing with God, when he wants to boycott God, but it reveals within him sort of that connection that we have with God. And so that's our job, to try and find God even in the darkest places. To wrestle with God during this time, to be angry at God, is hopefully to come to that awareness that God plays a role in our lives. God is the primary actor here, and that struggle, those doubts, that confusion, that's what we're left with to grapple with, to struggle with. That's not a negative thing; that's a positive thing, and that's something that ultimately brings us closer together. And finally, the third interpretation, that Bria, creation, also leads to health, to healing. In other words, once we talk about the fact that God creates the world constantly, then we see darkness and we ask, what in the world? What does this mean that God's creating the world constantly? So we're reminded that Bara also means that he conceals himself, and we have to reveal him through that darkness. Ultimately, we see that we live in a world that's sick, a world that is desperate for healing, a world that's really in bad shape. And it's our job to partner with God to bring healing to the world. So God creates the world to bring healing to the world. That the current state of the world, the current state of humanity, a place where people can celebrate death and glorify death and all of these horrors is unhealthy. It's unnatural and it's unhealthy. And it's our job to help partner with God to bring healing to that world, to bring sanity, to bring clarity, to bring morality to the world. That's our responsibility. When we can think about these ideas all embedded in the first few words of Bereshit, we will hopefully be moved to act, to bring that healing. And I'll just conclude with a thought that I heard the other day, a teaching of the great Hasidic master, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Barditchev, a third generation disciple of the Baal Shem Tov, who we were just quoting, who says, on the very first statement that we find from God, Vayomer Elokim Yehi Or, God said, let there be light, Vayihir, and there was light. So he said, Vayomer, a Jew, calls out and says, Elokim, God, Yehi Or, let there be light. This world is so dark. We call out to God, let there be light. We protest, we demand, and we reject this reality that we live in, and say to God, we know that you're creating constantly, but this is not the way, not with darkness, not with concealment. We pray that he reveal himself, and we also pray that what's happening and what's unfolding before us is going to set the stage to great miracles, to great wonders, to great salvation from God. And with that, hopefully bring healing. The ultimate healing, of course, being a world that we're all those that need to be returned home safely, return home safely. We live in a world where there's peace and security and safety. That's the ultimate healing, and miracle that hopefully we see very soon. We all pray for seeing that manifest immediately now. Amen.